In the music business, it's all about the relationships. And sometimes it's the relationship between a man, his best friend, and a guitar.
It's not going anywhere. It's where it's supposed to be, and it really is part of my connection to him now.
This is the reunion of two old friends. Colin Cripps, guitarist for Crash Vegas, Blue Rodeo, and Bryan Adams, and his 1952 Fender Telecaster. That's right, Telecaster.
I always wanted a great Telecaster, and even back then it was to have a 50s one. And this one came to me, and the fact that it was so unique because of the finish on it too. It's a sunburst finish. They call it two-tone sunburst. And this was the standard finish that they offered on the Stratocaster in the 50s. But it wasn't the standard finish they offered on Telecasters. So this would have been a complete custom order in 1955. Somebody decided they wanted the finish from a Strat on a Tele. And to this day, it's the only one I'd ever seen.
Colin Cripps calls it the best Telecaster he's ever played. One of the reasons he's kept it as a daily player for 15 years.
When I started playing it, it just sounded, you know, fantastic, and the neck was perfect on it.
The Telecaster was the creation of this man, Leo Fender. An accountant during the Great Depression, he also loved to fiddle around with radios and public address systems. In 1950, his tinkering produced the very first commercially available solid-body electric guitar.
The very first versions were actually called Esquires in the summer to fall of 1950, and then they changed the name to Broadcaster. And then in February of '51, Gretsch, they had a drum kit called the Broadcaster. So they called Fender and said, look, you can't use that name, you have to change the name. And Fender didn't have a name. They took the decal that said Fender Broadcaster on it, and they just cut the word Broadcaster off. They were called No-Casters. They didn't have a name.
It was the era of television, and when Fender had to find another name, he settled on Telecaster. And so was launched a legend. The Fender Telecaster was probably one of the simplest guitars ever constructed. Solid pine body on the prototype, ash after that, and a bolt-on maple neck. Yet for Colin, the sound is singular and inimitable.
I could play a brand new Telecaster, and to the average ear, it would sound like, well, it sounds twangy and bright and and it looks, you know, yeah, it's a Fender. And I could say, well, but I play a brand new one and it'll sound this way. I play one that's 56 years old, and it's got something, you know, the way that they built it back then. But the difference is the way it feels in my hands, and the way that maybe there's a certain nuance in the sound of it that speaks a little better to me.
Colin used the Tele, as it's called, continually. They seemed to belong together, even after the Telecaster and 3 other guitars were stolen in downtown Montreal in broad daylight. After an appeal to local radio and TV stations, he got a call from a pawn shop.
So literally the next day, in the car, drove to Montreal. This was one of them, which was a miracle that I even would have gotten it back. And then in 1992, I sold it for reasons I can't even explain today. You know, I'd had it 15 years. I had a lot of great guitars, and I wasn't using it as much. And I had a friend in New York. He started bugging me to buy it. The offer he made was too hard to refuse. And I thought, well, you know, it's going to a great home.
About 10 years later, yet another friend, Alex Lutsky, started to hanker after the Telecaster.
we sit around a lot of times, we talk about music, guitars, we go to shows, and as happens, you know, conversations come up. And one time I said, you know, if you ever wanted to get the best Telecaster I ever owned, it's this 1955 Sunburst Telecaster that Joe has. And so Alex started bugging Joe for the guitar, and Joe says, not for sale. It's not for sale. And this went on for about 5 years. So eventually, Alex got a guitar that Joe he had to have. And it was a 59 Les Paul. And so Alex said, okay, you want that Les Paul? You got to throw the Telecaster into the deal. So after 5 years of bugging him, Joe agreed to let Alex have the Telecaster back. And I remember the best part of it was that Alex was so excited about getting this guitar to bring it back to Toronto, that it had its life here. You know, it had a real musical life, and it had a history.
But the Telecaster's travels weren't over yet. They first had to take a tragic turn.
I couldn't really get too close to it again, because I thought, you know, it's not mine anymore. It's his, and it belongs where it is, you know. But tragically, my friend Alex passed away from a car accident. It was November of 2009. He had a number of instruments in his collection, and it was a very painful time to lose a really close friend. And he always brought out the best things in what owning these was about. You know, it wasn't about just putting them in a closet and them being possession so much as he played all the instruments he had. And he really loved this guitar. His wife, very generously, she came to me and said, you know, of all the people who should have this guitar back, it's you. And so that's how I've, you know, in a very bittersweet circumstance, I've reacquired it. It's not going anywhere. It's where it's supposed to be, and it really is part of my connection to him now.